to this live. This video is about psychopathy, female psychopaths, and it's a follow-up to the second video that I have posted about female psychopaths, the second non-live video, pre-recorded. And what I was doing in both of those videos was highlighting the work of Dr. Clive Body. And as I mentioned in the latest video that has been posted as part of the podcast series, he has come in for a bit of criticism, or at least questioning. And I think rightly so. That's what science is about. It is important that people put forward their theories, their thesis, and there is an antithesis, and between the two or three or more, we kind of gradually figure out what is the truth or seems to be closer to it. Now, to begin, I think it's fair to say that what constitutes a psychopath and psychopathy is a little bit woolly, to say the least. It's worth going back a little and considering that in terms of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, version 5, I think we're on at the moment, you can find psychopathy as basically a diagnostic criteria. That, in other words, psychopathy resides within, it is suggested, antisocial personality disorder. And that, of course, you probably be aware, is also associated with impulsiveness, aggression, and some people, but not all, will do things with criminal intent. And that's important to understand that it is important information, and it's important that we can categorize and we have diagnostic criteria, etc., etc. But it's not perfect. Psychopathy isn't there, as I've mentioned. It's not in that mix, but it is considered to be a subset or within the warp and weave of antisocial personality disorder. Psychopathy is, however, used by many professionals, clinically, forensically, and I think it is also an important distinction. I talked in the earlier video also about Robert Hare, who devised a really good, let me be upfront about this, a really important checklist. And I'm going to mention an article here which, or reference it actually, and quote a couple of bits and pieces from it, because if we think about the work of Robert Hare for a moment, you may be familiar with it. The Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, as it is now called, is probably considered, in fact, no, it's not probably, it is considered by many to be a gold standard, or one of the gold standards, or the gold standard in terms of ascertaining whether someone is a psychopath or has strong psychopathic traits. Now, that being said, this is where I think some of the slight confusion, to a degree, I believe it is, and also potentially conflict and disagreement can arise about whether Clive Body's work is actually capturing what has been going on and what these individuals that he's saying are psychopaths or likely psychopaths or have strong psychopathic traits are actually manifesting. That is what the behaviors tell us. And like so many things in the realm of psychology and understanding individuals, it is a bit woolly. It is often not quite clear cut, but that is the same in so many of the sciences, and including medicine. Some things are clear cut, but other things are not. That's why we have second and third opinions of course. So, or one of the reasons. So let me just look at this article, because what I want to do is I want to tease out in this video why I think that Clive Body is on the right track. But I also want to do it in a way which doesn't preclude or negate or diminish the work of Hare and his checklist and others who also have looked at ways to ascertain where someone may be a psychopath or not. So I'll put a link to this article in the description. I'm not going to read much of it. Unfortunately, I can't show you on the screen with this setup here at the moment. So the article is how many female psychopaths are there? And again, before I quote more from the article, I think it's important to recognize that the thrust of my interest, and I think a lot of researchers, is not to put the focus on females and ignore the males. It is to generate a proper understanding, a fair understanding of who is out there and who may have criminal intention as a primary or one of the primary motivators. But also we need to understand those people who can have strong psychopathic traits but are also not likely to commit overtly criminal acts. And within that mix, there are those who will not be psychopaths but have traits which are akin to psychopaths. So it's all about trying to understand the population and not to fall for biases, whether it's male or female, pro or con. It's important, and that's meant to be what science is about, to understand more about the world we live in, and of course more about people, well, depending on your discipline. So that was the title of the article, and let me just, in way of easing you into this subject as well, or re-easing you and or introducing you, the article says, some recent headlines featured claims by Clive Body from Anglia Ruskin University that there are more female psychopaths than originally believed, a lot more. So the common notion is that there are about 6 male psychopaths to 1 female, and Clive Body suggests that that figure could be closer to about 1.2 male psychopaths to 1 female. So it's far closer to 50-50. And from a video that I made a few months ago, judging by the comments, it doesn't seem to be a big surprise to people. And yet we're told, and this is repeated present day, that it's the males who are the psychopaths. But I think we can make those two versions of reality work together. People who aren't surprised when the research says that there are more female psychopaths, and those people who say the ratio is 6 to 1. And in fact, I think that I can also perhaps throw light on why Clive Body comes up with this figure of 1.2 to 1, or at least part of the rationale. And if we go down, then we get on to, and this, it's all the same article, it's all the one article. The Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised is the most validated diagnostic instrument for psychopathy. It translates the condition into a configuration of scores derived from 20 traits and behaviours. It has also been validated for assessing psychopathy in females. And yes, absolutely. And I certainly wouldn't dispute that. So it will pick up on psychopathy in females, but there is something subtle, which I believe we have to add in later, but not that subtle. And it says, female scores are a few points lower than for male offenders, says the instrument's inventor, Robert Hare. And if you looked at the previous recorded video that I did about female psychopaths, you will note that Robert Hare and another author criticised Clive Body's instrument, the one he uses to measure psychopathy. They said, no, that's not what we think psychopathy is. I totally agree with them. It isn't. And that's the point. And it's the point I hope to get to here. But let's crack on with this article. So the checklist revised, the hair one, is organised around 2 factors with 2 facets in each: interpersonal and affective components. So that's factor 1. So it includes traits like grandiosity, callousness, manipulativeness, and a lack of remorse. Factor 2 refers to lifestyle and antisocial behaviours, such as being aggressive, impulsive, and irresponsible. And it is that factor 2 that I would suggest, in my opinion, is more closely correlated with antisocial personality disorder. That's where I think we have that overlap. The grandiosity, the callousness, and the manipulativeness, one could argue, is also in the domain of the Machiavellian individual. It's also in the domain of the narcissist. And indeed, of course, there is often an overlap between psychopathy and narcissism. Clive Body thinks that one of the reasons that some psychopaths don't do that much damage is because there's a comorbidity with there could be Machiavellianism in there, but mainly a comorbidity with this idea of grandiosity. In other words, they are narcissists. So it stops them being so overt and doing so much because they want to be admired. They want to be liked. Again, depending on which type of narcissism you're looking at. These things are all connected, but let me hopefully keep this quite straightforward and not digress into infinity and beyond. So let me read this paragraph from the same article. Many researchers estimate the male to female ratio at 6:1 or higher, what I was saying already. Dr. Body, thinks that's wildly inaccurate. He argues for the ratio of 1.2:1 that I've already mentioned. Essentially saying there are 5 times more female psychopaths than we've realised. Yet, a search for Body's evidence shows that he relied on a subset of items on the Levinson self-report psychopathy scale. This 26-item instrument lets people evaluate themselves, and it's been criticised as being vulnerable to memory lapses and personal bias. Now, that is true, but it's not the full story. Having looked at in a bit more detail what Clive Body appears to have been doing, he has his own questions. He has his own checklist. And that's what he was using in his research. But he also used, at least in a couple of studies that he was doing, the Levinson self-report scale. So he did use that, but he also had his own. And in a couple of studies, he combined them. And they are all self-report. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the self-report is kind of as it sounds. Like you look at the question and say, well, I think that, and fill this in. Whereas the hair psychopathy checklist requires someone who's trained to administer it and interpret, and maybe in some versions or some aspects of it or situations, ask questions and observe reactions. And that observation and that ability to be trained, I think, is a great thing. Don't get me wrong, I'm not criticising that. I think that's really important. And Hare's argument is that because being branded, so to speak, as a psychopath, although we're getting more understanding of it now, and we understand that it's wrong to think of people as being like the evil that they are portrayed in movies, although some are, but an awful lot aren't. That if that is going to be the diagnosis, then it is important to get it right. It is important to control it, to keep this test as something which can be administered only by trained professionals, and it's also copyrighted. And I think that's good. It makes absolute sense to me. So it's not a critique of Hare. What I hope to critique a little bit is this sense that Body is doing something which isn't valid. And as far as I understand so far, in terms of my research, I think it is valid, which is where I want to hopefully get to next. And if I go on with this article, yeah, even if the Levinson self-report psychopathy scale stacks up diagnostically to clinically directed scales. In other words, you know, the subtext of that is it as good as the hair checklist? Does it do the same thing? It's important to see how Dr. Body collects and analyses his data in order to compare his claims to the wider pool of research on female psychopathy. Who was his subject in the pool, etc. How many? Now that detail, and if you watched the previous video and you clicked on the link to Clive Body's talk, he does talk in that talk about some of the figures that he used, and they do seem to be relatively similar to some of the studies, and I'll mention one here in terms of hair's research, in terms of sample size. So. And then the article goes on. It's not as if there was no research on female psychopaths. In fact, the past decade has seen quite a lot. Hare devised a PCL screening version, so the psychopathy checklist screening version, slimmed down to 12 items that yield the same factor structure as the PCLR, the checklist revised. Using a 2015 study with 343 non-forensic female subjects, meaning non-criminal in this context, showed higher psychopathy scores on the interpersonal dimension: manipulative, grandiose, and charming. So higher, and I think that means higher than average. It's not actually clear from the article. So 343, that was the study. That's quite similar to some of Dr. Body's study sizes. Female subjects showed higher than average, again, I think I'm right in interpreting it that way, scores on the interpersonal dimension: manipulative, grandiose, and charming. So that's great, and no dispute there. But if we could go back to the earlier part of what it tells us about hair, and also I mentioned what I talked about in the previous video, and what it says is that the PCL revised, the Psychopathy checklist revised, Hare's one, organises itself around two factors: interpersonal and affective emotional components, grandiosity, callousness, manipulativeness, and a lack of remorse. Factor 2, lifestyle, antisocial, aggressive, impulsive. So what we just heard is that using the screening version of the Hare psychopathy checklist, they found that there was an element of manipulativeness. And what they were not saying is that, as far as I'm reading it from that article, they were not saying that there was aggression, impulsiveness, and irresponsibleness, that factor 2, which I think links neatly to antisocial personality disorder, when there can be a lot of aggression and crime. So what the Hare checklist, the screening version, appears to have picked up on are those other parts, the manipulativeness, for example, and saying that some females, again, if I'm reading it the right way, scored higher than average, if you're with me so far. So, good. Does that negate Clive Body's work? And I would say absolutely not. I think what it shows is that he's on the right track, because, as I understand it, that Hare checklist screening version, I could be wrong, but as far as I understand it, also looks at the aggression, impulsive, and irresponsible facets. So what this author is saying is that using the Hare screening version for psychopathy, they found that in terms of manipulativeness, if I could use that as a catch-all, and I hope I'm not muddying the waters too much by using that as a catch-all, that some females had higher than average scores. So they were sort of picking up something. But in the mix, when they're scoring this, they've also got the capacity to pick up on aggression, impulsiveness, and irresponsibility. And my guess is that what will have been found is that males are higher on that And in terms of manipulativeness, some females were higher than average, but probably either the same as the males, or if they were higher than the males, not by much. But it tells us something. But if you look at the checklist, the hair one, certainly the revised version, and probably also the screening version, my suspicion is because of the way it's geared and it requires people who are highly trained to administer it, what they're trying to weed out is someone a risk to society? That's one of the things they want to find, I should say. Is someone a risk? Because the screening version is almost like a catch-all. And then what you can do is say, oh, there's something going on here. Let's use the full psychopathy checklist revised hair version to delve into this more thoroughly. So if that's the case, if it's a screening version that may warrant more in-depth investigation, then there have to be things in that screening version that could catch those potentially dangerous to society individuals, male or female. So, and that's all well and good. That's great. But what Clive Body is doing, as I understand it, is he is ignoring, this was his point, he's ignoring the antisocial and aggressive part of the psychopath's makeup. Because his whole, I suppose, area of interest and expertise is in not the criminal courts, but is in the corporate world. And he'll talk about corporate psychopaths. That doesn't mean to say they head up the organisation. Some of them may well do. And Hare himself has looked at this. There are those in corporations who have strong psychopathic traits, and they can be CEOs. And some people argue it can give them a bit of an edge, but they can do a heck of a lot of damage as well, which is what Clive Body argues. And so what he's looked at specifically is not the overt aggression. He's looked at the subtle aggression. He's looked at the psychological aggression. He's looked at grandiose behaviors. He's looked at things like a sense of, does this make you feel like you belong, and trust, etc., etc., etc. And he's looked at the damage that can be done by people, male and female, who, by his measure, probably register as psychopaths. He also talks about people who are further along the scale, the spectrum than the normal population, who may not trigger the score to say you are a psychopath, but perhaps the amber alert flashes because they can still be quite damaging to people around them. And as an aside, but I think a relevant one, he also suggests that those people who are psychopaths, as far as he's concerned, tend to find that the people below them will leave, they can get ill mentally and physically, and all sorts of things go wrong, but the ones who stay are often psychopaths themselves, because of this lack of emotional engagement. And from the other video, to put this part in now, I didn't want to put it in earlier because it may have really confused things, is that Body's looking at primary psychopathy. He's looking at those people who it is suggested are born psychopaths. And there is some debate about that. And of course, we've got to take on board the fact that we have epigenetics and the environment can change things. But at the moment, the concept from the perspective of a lot of people who've looked at this is that some people are born that way. The environment can play a big role, and those are called secondary psychopaths. But the primary psychopath, there is a dulling of the emotional response to those around them. In other words, they lack empathy. In other words, they may find that under pressure, they're also not fearful like those around them. That herd instinct that can cause us to pick up on the fear and the terror, the psychopath can remain cool. And you can see how that could be a huge advantage. Could be a huge advantage in business as well. Could be a huge advantage in many areas and facets of life. But also it can be a disadvantage because without that empathy, then what stops them? What do they care about the damage that they do? And so on one level, the psychopath who's charming and is manipulative, but wants power, wants control, often, but not always, wants the riches that go with certain positions, they will manipulate themselves their way to the top and have probably quite a Machiavellian outlook on life, and may also have, as I mentioned already, that sense of grandiosity, to be a form of a psychopath, sorry, not a psychopath, a narcissist. And what that can then mean is that the organization and the people within it are damaged. And so this is what Clive Body's looking at. I think that's a fair assessment. So in that world, you may not see overt aggression. You may not see overt criminality. So he's only looked at, as far as I understand it, the interpersonal and affective components: grandiosity, callousness, manipulativeness. And again, if you watched the other video, you would hear and see some of the quotes from his research, that qualitative research that he did, where he looked at and listened to and interviewed and got people to fill out questionnaires, what their experience was. And from that, and then looking back at research that he had already done, so he wasn't looking for female psychopaths in most of that research. When he looked at it again and ran it through his particular checklist, and as I've mentioned, with a couple of components of Levinson in there, he found that when you took out the overt criminality aspect of psychopathy, but looked at the psychological damage that could be done, then lo and behold, there were many more females who were registering on the system than there had been before. But that doesn't mean to say there weren't males. Of course there were males. As I said already, it's not about that. It's about trying to figure out who this population, or what this population consists of in terms of those people that are beneficial to the organization, to the psychological well-being of the business, and to other things as well, like a lack of churn, a lack of attrition, an increase in motivation, and an increase in innovation. All those stuff, all those things, all that stuff, it is enhanced when you have good leadership and a good environment. It is destroyed, diminished, diluted when you have bad and poor leaders, and also you are in a business, in an organization or a team, can be public sector very much as well, of course, that is seeded with people who are manipulative, shallow, lacking in empathy, cruel. That's awful, and you don't need too many of them, and particularly you don't need too many of them if they're in positions of power and influence to destroy all those things and others that I mentioned already, or at least to reduce them. So that's where his focus has been. So to look at instruments which also include the more obvious psychopathic traits that we would associate with antisocial personality disorder, and indeed to look at those traits that are very often highlighted in the movies, that's wrong, because that's not what Clive Body was doing. He's quite specifically saying, I'm not doing that. At least that's my understanding of it. And I think it is such an interesting area. It is such an important topic. It is such an important subject. It is such an important facet of the human condition that we do need more and more research, and we need more and more information, and we require more discussions about all this stuff, because we need to understand ourselves in the first instance, and we need to understand other people. And we also need, in my opinion, to understand who is likely to do us harm. And on one hand, it is the obvious harm of criminality, but on the other hand, it is the less obvious harm, but very often no less damaging, of someone who is psychologically abusive and cruel. And we need to understand that, and we need to understand whether the people in any given population are higher on that scale, that they would set that alarm off as being psychopaths, irrespective of whether they are male or female. And that is why I think Clive Body's work is important, and it's also why I think that he's on the right track. But he does himself say, and I'll finish off with this, that what is lacking for all these researchers is a much larger scale survey of the population. And some people wouldn't want to take part, and some people would try and skew it and all sorts of things, but that can be factored in. There are a lot of clever researchers out there, because to get a closer to accurate understanding of who is in the population is so important. As I've said already, it's important for your well-being, my well-being, the people around us, their well-being, and it is important for those areas within which we exist a lot of the time, whether it's within the community, whether it's within the public sector or the private sector, or one could argue some kind of local community voluntary organisation. It is important, and what we need to do, and we'll definitely finish off with this, is we need to understand who we're promoting and who we have in businesses. We need HR departments that are far more fleet of foot than often some of them are currently, and we need an ability to have open and honest cultures which are not run on fear, but instead are run on psychologically safe principles. I've talked about that before, but I will not branch off into that. Otherwise, you'll never get away for your cup of coffee or whatever it is you do now. Thanks for listening to this and tuning in. For the moment, for me, bye for now.